We stand on the verge of opening a door that was never meant to be unlocked. A former priest steps into the light. He offers no speculation, only the things he witnessed and heard. What he's about to reveal could upend everything we've ever accepted as fact. Secret chambers, concealed documents, history rewritten by those who swore sacred oaths. For years, he served within the Vatican's walls, gaining access to forbidden archives and reading pages that were never meant to see the light of day. This isn't just about hidden texts or ancient rituals. It's about how the passage of time, collective wisdom, and even our memories have been manipulated. Entire ages were shaped in secrecy while the world looked to Rome for answers. Now, an insider is finally breaking his silence, not with whispers, but with the whole truth. Watch closely. Subscribe, because tonight we hear from the man who walked away. And once you learn what he uncovered, nothing will be the same. The Church is said to have an infallible memory, that wearing the collar binds you for life. But what's never discussed is what happens when that collar becomes a noose. I was once among them. I recited prayers in ancient tongues. I wandered those echoing stone corridors. I believed, without a doubt. Yet truth has a way of seeping through the smallest cracks. And once it's in, it never leaves. My faith in God didn't fade. I left because I saw what was being hidden in his name. Certain Vatican rooms are always off limits to most priests. Tunnels beneath tunnels, access reserved for a select few. I was one of them. At first, I thought it was a privilege, a reward for my devotion. But the deeper I ventured, the darker it became, until only unanswered questions remained. One night stands out in my memory. A storm raged over Rome. The lights flickered, and I was summoned to assist in a part of the archives few even know exist. No cameras, no recorders. Just silence, ancient dust, and the scent of dried blood on yellowed parchment. I found scrolls older than any textbook I'd ever seen, written in strange languages that felt oddly familiar. Documents that told different stories, about beginnings, about time, about humanity. That night, something inside me shifted. It was like looking in a mirror and seeing a stranger. I realised the history I'd been teaching wasn't the truth. It wasn't even close. It was a script, and we were all actors, reciting lines written long before we were born. I stayed silent for months. I kept up the rituals, led services, heard confessions. I kept a calm face before bishops who hid secrets behind their eyes. But inside, I was unravelling. The lies weren't just in the old texts, they lived in the silence. In books we weren't allowed to read, in names erased from records, in years that simply disappeared. Eventually, I left. No farewells, no drama. I left my collar on the altar and stepped into the night. Since then, I've kept to the shadows, but I can't stay silent anymore. The world deserves to know the truth. Not to destroy faith, but to rebuild it on something genuine. Not fear, not control, truth. This is my story. Not whispered in confessionals, but spoken openly beneath the sky. Because sometimes the greatest wrongs aren't just individual acts. They're woven into institutions, protected by robes, sanctified by secret rites behind gold and marble. If you think you know the Vatican, think again. What I saw was forbidden knowledge. What I read was meant to be erased. Until now. The religious community was always quiet, always watchful. A silence that didn't bring peace, but suspicion, as if the very stones were eavesdropping. When I first arrived as a novice, I thought it was sacred, a place where questions would be answered and doubts would vanish. But the longer I stayed, the more I realised the silence wasn't holy, it was enforced. We were taught to interpret scripture, but only from certain perspectives. If you asked too many questions, even politely, the older priests would smile and change the subject. If you persisted, they'd recommend meditation and fasting. That was their signal. Stop asking. Some scriptures were studied in detail, Others were barely mentioned, and some names were only whispered after dark when someone dared to speak freely. An early Christianity class changed everything for me. The priest teaching it was careful, always sticking to approved texts. But one day he accidentally mentioned a gospel I'd never heard of, the Gospel of Thomas. He stopped, glanced around, and told us to ignore it. It wasn't part of the official canon. He moved on, but I couldn't let it go. I approached him privately. He looked at me, and in a low voice said some writings were excluded for good reasons. Then he walked away. That night, I went to the monastery's library. The lights were dim, and most books were locked behind glass. The ones I could reach were all identical, church-approved translations, theological summaries, stories of saints. But I started to notice what was missing. No original texts, no alternative views, no space for personal interpretation. Just carefully selected knowledge repeated until it became fact. We weren't just learning scripture. We were being taught how to think, or rather how not to think beyond the boundaries. It was subtle manipulation. No one ever said, "Stop thinking." They just redirected you if you strayed. Gradually, most students accepted it. They nodded, memorized, passed their exams. They called it faith, but some of us whispered. In the gardens after evening prayers, in library corners, we talked about forbidden books and unanswered questions. We wondered if we were there to find the truth or to forget it. In the monastery, truth wasn't denied. It was filtered. We were told not to lie, but never to stray from the official story. And in that silence, something ancient stirred. Not faith, but a sense that beyond the rituals and respect, the real story was waiting. It was never on any map, no signs, no catalogue entry, but everyone inside the Vatican knew it existed. They just never spoke of it. Like a ghost room built into the foundation, hidden in plain sight. I found it by accident. I'd been assigned to help an archivist deep in the Vatican library. Most of the work was dull, cataloguing Latin manuscripts, cleaning old scrolls, making inventory lists. But the deeper you went, the heavier the air became, as if time itself slowed the further you got from sunlight. One day, I was pushing a cart of books through a basement corridor when I noticed a side hallway I'd never seen. It looked ordinary, just a stone arch with an old wooden door at the end. But the light above it was on. That was odd. No one had ever sent me that way, and the deeper sections were usually locked. I should have ignored it. But something drew me in. The door was slightly open. I pushed it. It didn't creak. It just swung open. Inside was a narrow staircase lit by flickering bulbs. No guards, no security, just silence. At the bottom was a heavy iron and wood door, missing a handle but not locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was nothing like the rest of the library. No neat shelves, no labels, no signs. The room was chaotic, scrolls piled everywhere, books with no titles, manuscripts in unknown languages. Some were just scattered on tables, as if someone had just been reading them. And the smell, older than dust, like the past itself. One scroll caught my attention. It was covered in strange symbols, circles, star charts, notes in Latin, Greek, and something even older. The text wasn't just telling a story, it was a warning. I felt it in my gut. This wasn't meant for just anyone. I didn't hear the door open behind me, but suddenly I wasn't alone. An old priest entered. He didn't shout or look surprised. He just watched me for a moment, then said, "You shouldn't have seen this." He didn't threaten me. He just took the manuscript from my hands and gestured for me to leave. I never spoke of it again. But from that moment, I understood. The Vatican doesn't just protect history. It changes it. It edits it. And sometimes it buries it. The secrecy runs so deep that even those who serve inside its walls often forget what it is they're guarding or why. My journey began with a simple footnote, a barely noticeable line in a dense theological commentary we were assigned during training. It referenced a verse that was missing from our Bible. At first, I dismissed it as a printing error, but then I realised something odd. The verse did exist, just not in our translation, nor in any version the Church permitted us to use. That tiny detail became an obsession. I started to compare different biblical texts, the Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, Coptic manuscripts, even ancient Syriac fragments. Slowly, a pattern started to form. Stories shifted in tone, names vanished. Whole passages were shortened or reworded. Some texts included warnings, others ended abruptly, as if someone had carefully trimmed them to fit a certain mould. There's one night I'll never forget. I managed to obtain a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, not through official channels, but from a digitized manuscript found in Egypt and translated by independent scholars. It was raw, unfiltered. It didn't depict Jesus as the other Gospels did. There were no miracles, no resurrection, just teachings, deep, mysterious, and challenging. What struck me most was how different it felt. Not a heavenly saviour, but a teacher of inner wisdom. Someone who urged people to look within, not just follow blindly. I showed it to an older priest I trusted. He didn't even open it. He glanced at the cover and called it heretical, not because it was untrue, but because it wasn't meant for the public. He explained that the Church had long ago chosen to protect the faithful, to keep the message simple and pure. The early councils decided what was sacred and what was problematic. That word stuck with me. Problematic. Not false, not evil, just inconvenient. I dug deeper. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Philip, all genuine, all left out. Some spoke of the divine feminine, others described celestial cycles and questioned the idea of sin. Each was hidden, not destroyed, just buried, locked away in languages only a few could read. It became clear that the Bible isn't a flawless record. It's a collection, curated by people, edited over centuries, translated to serve certain goals. To guide faith, yes, but also to maintain control. When people say the Bible is the Word of God, they don't realise how many human hands shaped it, how many voices were silenced, how many truths were labelled heresy. The most unsettling part isn't that pages are missing. It's that we were never supposed to know they were gone. It was meant to be just another lesson, a routine class on church calendars and holy days. But something felt off. We were learning how Easter is calculated, by the first full moon after the spring equinox. Straightforward, until a student asked, what if the stars no longer matched those dates? The room went silent. The priest smiled awkwardly and mumbled about tradition and authority. That was the first red flag. If the Church claims to follow the heavens, why ignore what the sky reveals? That night, I stayed in the library, comparing old almanacs and dates. The more I looked, the more confused I became. Astronomical data showed the spring equinox had shifted over centuries. What once happened in Aries now happened in Pisces. Yet the Church insisted everything was in sync. It wasn't. I kept digging. Our current calendar, the Gregorian, was set in 1582. Before that, it was the Julian. But even those weren't the first. Ancient civilizations tracked the stars and seasons with incredible accuracy. They adapted when the sky changed. The Church didn't. It declared time, set dates, chose which feasts to celebrate and when. Gradually, reality drifted away from ritual. One of the most surprising things I found was that Christmas doesn't fall near Jesus' actual birth. It was picked to replace old pagan solstice festivals. Even Easter echoed ancient spring fertility rites. The weekly cycle was changed to match biblical stories, not the cosmos. Maybe all this would be fine if the Church admitted it, but instead it claimed these dates were absolute, divinely ordained, as if God himself had set the calendar. I started to wonder if time itself had been rewritten. What else had been changed to fit the story? Some say it doesn't matter. The dates are just symbols, and meaning is more important than accuracy. But when the stars above you no longer match the story you're told, something cracks. Questions flood in. If the church could change time, what stopped it from changing history or memory or truth? That night, I went outside and looked up. The stars were clear, silent witnesses. They didn't care what dates we chose. They told a different story, one the church tried to imitate but never could. In that gap between heaven and tradition, I realized the stars were right. We were the ones who had wandered. Deep inside the Vatican, there's a corridor few ever see. No tourists, no photos, just silence and endless rows of filing cabinets. I was helping an old archivist sort documents one day. When he left to take a call, I was told to stay put. But curiosity doesn't obey. I wandered a little and found a cabinet that wasn't locked. Inside were files with names of saints I'd never heard of: St. Minulf, St. Labrada, St. Sicarius of Brantome. The documents looked official, but something was off. Most had no birth dates, some no locations, just short notes about miracles or martyrdoms, more like legends than real lives. One folder simply said, "No longer recognized." That phrase chilled me. It was as if these saints had been quietly erased, not by violence, but by paperwork. When the archivist returned, I asked about one of the names. He smiled and said, "Not all saints stay saints. Sometimes stories fall apart. Sometimes evidence vanishes or never existed." That answer unsettled me. I researched the official list of saints, thousands of names. But when I tried to trace their stories, I hit dead ends. Churches named after people who may never have lived. Statues of saints with no historical record. Miracles credited to names that first appeared centuries after their supposed deaths. At first I thought it was just poor record keeping, but then I found internal memos from the 1960s during a major review called The Reform of the Roman Martyrology. Dozens of saints were quietly removed or downgraded. Some were called pious legends. Others were suspected fakes. The church never made a big announcement. It just happened. That's when I realized sainthood wasn't just about faith. It was about power. The stories of saints were used to teach, to inspire, to shape behavior. If those stories needed to be changed or erased, they were. But what about the people who prayed to them for generations? The communities built around their relics? The children named after them? What happens when your protector is declared imaginary? I started to wonder how many other names had been invented or erased without anyone noticing. How much of our history was built on figures who only existed in sermons and paperwork? The church didn't need to burn books. It could just close the file and move on. Sometimes, the most dangerous stories aren't the ones told, but the ones that quietly disappear, with no one left to ask why. That day, I understood that saints weren't just saints. They were edited. And in those edits, another story was hidden. The first time I saw chained books, I thought it was to protect them. Old leather covers, heavy iron clasps, thick chains bolted to stone desks. But then I realized these weren't books meant to be read. They were meant to stay closed. The language inside wasn't for everyone. It was Latin, but not the kind we learned. This Latin was older, twisted, almost rewritten to hide more than it revealed. There was one manuscript I remember clearly. It looked like a book of parables, but the language was dense, needlessly complex. Instead of "God is light," it said, "Divine illumination manifests through metaphysical emanation." It sounded scholarly, but it was meant to confuse, to make the meaning so hard that only trained priests could understand, or think they could. I asked my mentor why the church didn't just translate everything for everyone. When I asked him, he replied, "Not everyone is ready for the truth." He spoke with conviction, as if shielding believers from certain knowledge was a sacred duty, as if truth itself required a gatekeeper. That was when I began to see the recurring pattern. Ancient manuscripts, written in Greek or Aramaic, would surface, clear, profound, sometimes even poetic, but once translated into Latin, everything shifted, meanings were altered, new words appeared, entire sections would vanish, and the Latin versions became the official doctrine, the ones taught, preached, and enshrined. It wasn't just translation, it was transformation. I once stumbled upon an old gospel, side by side with its Latin translation. The original read, "The kingdom of God is within you." But the Latin version changed it to, "The kingdom of God is not for everyone to understand." That single alteration reversed the message. One empowers, the other excludes. It dawned on me that the church's real power wasn't in its buildings or riches. It was in its control of language. The words we were permitted to hear, and those buried beneath layers of translation and ritual. In the early days, there were countless Christian writings, letters, visions, teachings. They didn't always agree. Some spoke of reincarnation, others of cosmic cycles and distant worlds. Some even hinted at knowledge far ahead of their time. But the church decided which texts to translate, which to promote, and which to lock away. The deeper I explored the archives, the clearer it became. Language itself was a barrier, a tool to keep the masses compliant. If you can't read the rules, you can't challenge them. The truth wasn't erased, it was hidden, encrypted in Latin. Few could read it, and fewer still could truly grasp it. The chains weren't just iron, they were silence, they were fear, they were obedience disguised as faith. We were taught that the Middle Ages were a time of collapse. After Rome fell, the world supposedly forgot how to reason, how to build, how to dream. People stopped reading. Science vanished. Progress stalled. But what if that story isn't quite true? What if the darkness was intentional? This thought struck me one night, reading a forgotten lecture transcript deep in the Vatican's archives. It wasn't even secret, just ignored. The lecturer argued that the early Middle Ages weren't as backward as we're told. He claimed knowledge wasn't lost, but withheld. At first I thought he exaggerated, but the records showed massive gaps. For nearly 3 centuries there are almost no original writings, no inventions, no reliable history, as if time itself had been erased. That's when I learned about a theory few dare mention. The phantom time hypothesis. It proposes that entire centuries were fabricated or deleted from history, that rulers and popes conspired to rewrite timelines, to conceal events, or to legitimize their own power. It sounds wild, until you realize how much of our calendar was set by popes. How many dates were changed without evidence? How many documents are just copies of copies? Even if time wasn't invented, as the theory claims, one thing is clear. The church decided what survived. Books that contradicted doctrine were burned. Scholars who questioned too much were silenced. Libraries were destroyed in the name of purity. The few places that preserved old knowledge became monasteries, accessible only to monks. Ordinary people couldn't own scriptures, study the stars, or ask about the origins of ideas. Knowledge became a privilege and ignorance a virtue. Some inventions we credit to the Renaissance actually existed centuries earlier, but they were forgotten or hidden. Glass, lenses, advanced maps, mechanical devices, all disappeared only to be rediscovered later as if they were new. But they weren't. They were suppressed, locked away, or destroyed to maintain control. The more I learned, the more I saw that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark because of chaos. They were dark because someone had extinguished the light. When truth threatens power, it becomes dangerous. And in those centuries, as the church grew more powerful than any king or emperor, it decided what was sacred and what was forbidden, what was remembered and what was erased. It wasn't a time without knowledge, it was a time without access. That's the real danger of forgetting. Not that things are lost, but that they're hidden deliberately for the sake of order. And once you see this pattern, it's impossible to ignore. You start to question how much of history is actually just rewritten memory. We were told the Jesuits were teachers, missionaries, men of discipline and learning. They dressed plainly, spoke gently, and always seemed to serve a higher cause. But beneath that public image was something much more secretive. There's something most priests never learn, something I only discovered after taking my vows. The Society of Jesus began in the 16th century, and from the start it was unlike anything else. Jesuits weren't just priests. They were soldiers, trained in obedience, strategy, and unwavering loyalty. Everyone knew their main vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But among the older clergy, there were rumours of a fourth vow, absent from official texts, taken only by a chosen few in secret. This fourth vow is simple in words, but immense in consequence. It's a pledge of direct loyalty to the Pope, not just in faith, but in missions, politics, and secrecy. Those who take it promise to go wherever the Pope commands, to do whatever is asked. No questions, no hesitation, and their missions rarely appear in official records. I once met a Jesuit who had served in several countries, always under false names. He claimed his work was spiritual, but when I pressed, he smiled oddly and said, "Divine combat takes many forms." Then he turned away, as if he'd revealed too much. The Jesuit hierarchy doesn't end with the Pope. It runs through the Superior General, known as the Black Pope, not for his skin but for his attire, his role, his authority. While the Pope appears in public, blessing crowds and waving from balconies, the Black Pope operates in the shadows. Few know his identity, fewer still grasp his reach. He commands thousands of Jesuits worldwide, their schools, their missions, their networks. And while they teach order and faith, they also gather intelligence. They influence governments. They are present where laws are made and conflicts are shaped, always silent, always observing. The fourth vow binds them not just to God, but to a hidden power structure. Once sworn, there's no turning back. You don't debate your actions. You don't question your orders. You move unseen through the world's systems, leaving no trace. And if you resist, you vanish. Many dismiss this as legend, claiming Jesuits are just educators and loyal servants. But I've read the documents. I've studied the secret rules. I've met men whose real names are unknown. The Church hides many truths, but the Jesuits don't just guard secrets, they create them. And the fourth vow is how everything stays protected. Not all warriors wear armour. Not all battles are fought with weapons. Some are waged quietly through paperwork, through whispers, through a loyalty so deep it's invisible. There's a hidden chamber beneath Vatican City that few mention. No stained glass, no gold, just bare stone and heavy wooden doors. It's not called a courtroom, it's a tribunal, but it's unlike any court you know. No jury, no audience, just a desk, a chair, and several men in dark robes questioning and judging. I attended once, as a silent witness to something ancient and secret. They called it a doctrinal examination, but that was just a cover. It was really a hearing, not for criminals, but for thinkers, for doubters, for those who dared to suggest reality might differ from church teaching. The accused was a clergyman, old, thin, gentle. His only offence was writing a paper suggesting Genesis was symbolic, that creation unfolded over ages, that faith and knowledge could coexist. He didn't preach it, he didn't distribute it, he only shared it with academic peers, and one betrayed him. The questioning was relentless, calculated, designed to trap him. Did he accept the Bible as literal truth? Did he deny divine creation of humanity? Did he submit to the Church's authority on the origins of life? He answered with care and respect, but it didn't matter. The verdict was already decided. He was found guilty of doctrinal error, not heresy. They avoid that word now. but the outcome was the same. He was silenced, barred from teaching. His research was confiscated, his reputation quietly destroyed. No public execution, no chains, just quiet erasure. He was never seen again. Later, I found old files of heresies, stored in a cabinet with faded Latin names I recognised. Bruno, executed for claiming stars were distant suns. Galileo, condemned for saying the earth moved. And others, unknown. Scholars, doctors, visionaries, all punished for seeing too much or speaking too soon. The Church didn't just resist knowledge, it feared it. Not because it threatened God, but because it threatened authority. Every discovery shifted the balance of power. Every new idea challenged the belief that only the Church held the keys to truth. Some files contained confessions, some forced, some tortured. Their methods were unfeeling, systematic, and absolute. Once someone was labelled a heretic, their destiny was set. Strangely, many of their principles would later be validated. What unsettled me most wasn't the past, but how those mechanisms still function today. The rituals, the quiet, the secret meetings in deserted chambers. Not every prison is made of iron. Some are constructed from fear, rules, and the certainty that asking the wrong question means you'll never ask again. It all began with a routine assignment. I was sorting through old papal records for a senior archivist. Births, deaths, official blessings. It should have been straightforward, just cataloguing paperwork. But inconsistencies emerged. Some names appeared in one ledger but were missing from another. Certain popes had no background, no records, just a name and a title, as if they'd appeared from thin air and disappeared just as quickly. Initially, I blamed poor record keeping. After all, these were centuries-old documents. Errors were inevitable. But the more I investigated, the stranger it became. One pope had 3 different dates of death. Another was credited with miracles. Yet there was no evidence, no coins, no writings, nothing to prove he existed. Still, the Church had recognised him as a legitimate pope for generations. One case was especially odd, a pope who supposedly ruled for 10 days, then was buried in secret. No explanation, no details, just a fleeting mention in a single document and silence everywhere else. No grave, no portrait, no trace. Yet his name persisted in Vatican records, as if repetition alone made him real. It felt like chasing shadows. I confided in a colleague. He warned me not to dig too deep, explaining that sometimes identities were inserted to keep the timeline intact, to smooth over transitions, especially in the early centuries when politics and faith were inseparable. But it wasn't just about filling gaps. Entire lives were fabricated to uphold the system. I started searching for outside perspectives, researchers who'd noticed the same patterns. They called them phantom popes, fictional popes, figures who existed only in records, leaving no mark on the world. Some even speculated that certain popes were actually the same person under different names. Then there was the legend of Pope Joan, the supposed first female pope. The Church dismissed her story, but it was whispered across Europe. Some claimed she ruled disguised as a man, others saw it as a cautionary myth. Either way, her tale hinted at a deeper truth. Papal records weren't as flawless as claimed. In a faith rooted in tradition, the succession of popes is sacred, a direct line from St. Peter to today. It's seen as an unbroken chain of legitimacy. But when you find weak or missing links, the whole chain trembles. The truth is, popes were human, chosen by other humans, not by divine decree. Sometimes their names were recorded for political reasons, to cover up gaps or to mask missing years. I once thought papal records were carved in stone. Now I see they're more like ink on water. Some names were never real, just echoes meant to preserve an illusion. One quiet morning in the archive, with only the sound of turning pages and footsteps on stone, I was tasked with organising a pile of unmarked documents. Most were harmless. Sermons, drafts, old ledgers. But at the bottom, I found something different. An old envelope sealed with a strange symbol. Not the cross or papal crest, but something older. Inside was a letter in flawless Latin, but the writing was hurried, almost frantic. The script changed part-way through, as if several people had contributed. The first pages discussed astronomy, timelines, and cosmic patterns. Then the tone shifted. It described a deliberate reshaping of history. Dates altered, events reassigned, centuries blended together. Popes and rulers were moved around in time, as if history was a puzzle rearranged in secret. Some events were repeated under new names. Others were invented to hide long periods of nothingness. The letter claimed this was necessary for the Church's stability. A revision for the faithful. My hands shook as I read. One section detailed how certain documents were to be edited before being placed in the public archive, while the originals were locked away in a secret vault. There was a list of altered documents with notes on what had been changed. Dates, names, places, everything. The most disturbing part came at the end. In red ink, a warning. If the truth ever surfaced, it would shatter not just church history, but the foundations of Western civilization, ideas of progress, royal legitimacy, even scientific and astronomical trust. The letter insisted most people would never believe it anyway. The deception was too deep, too woven into culture, education, and memory. I was paralyzed. I could pretend I hadn't found it or report it and watch it vanish into the archives. But something inside me snapped. I thought of students learning from carefully edited textbooks, of believers building faith on timelines arranged like stage props. I remembered the restricted knowledge, the phantom popes, the missing saints. This was the final revelation. That day I walked out of the archive and never returned. I left everything behind, because once you see the pattern behind the illusion, you can't pretend it's real anymore. Maybe that's why they hide it. Not because the truth is unbearable, but because once you see it, you start questioning everything. And that's their greatest fear. A world full of people demanding answers. History should be a sequence of events, each year following the last. But what if some of those years were invented? What if entire centuries were inserted on purpose? It sounds impossible until you look closely at the flaws. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. This is the phantom time theory. It proposes that about 3 centuries of our history never actually happened, specifically the years 614 to 911 AD. This missing era includes countless events and rulers, even the founding of the Holy Roman Empire. But according to this theory, those years were fabricated, turning fiction into accepted history. At the centre of this idea are 2 men, Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Otto was a powerful figure in medieval Europe, ambitious and obsessed with Rome's legacy. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be a true Roman Caesar, but his own time didn't fit that dream. So with Pope Sylvester he devised a plan. Advance the calendar, invent centuries, and make it seem as if Otto ruled in the year 1000, a number loaded with meaning, making his reign seem destined and divinely chosen. This wasn't just about ego, it was about legitimacy. If Otto could tie himself to Rome's glory at a sacred moment, he'd become legendary. Pope Sylvester wasn't a typical pope. He was a scholar, mathematician, and, some whispered, a magician. He understood astronomy, calendars and numbers, enough to alter time itself without being caught. Back then few people could read. No one had personal calendars. Time was announced by the church through bells and rituals. So when leaders declared it was the year 1000, people accepted it. History was rewritten to fit the new timeline, but traces of the forgery remain. Archaeologists have found far fewer genuine artifacts from this period than expected. Architectural progress nearly stopped, Written records are scarce. It's as if time slowed down or old stories were recycled with new names. Even ancient manuscripts repeat themselves. Same conflicts, different characters, the same kings in different places. As if someone copied old chronicles to create new ones. If this theory is true, then what we call the Dark Ages might be a carefully crafted illusion, a stage play written by those who wanted to control how the future would remember the past. The Church put itself at the centre, not just recording time, but rebuilding it, entry by entry. Once you notice these gaps, history feels less like reality and more like a script. Someone long ago decided how the story should go. But the stars don't lie. They rise and set with a precision no empire can fake. Long before telescopes or star charts, people used the sky to track time, for farming, travel, and memory. When the Church rewrote history, the stars became silent witnesses. No matter how many records you change, the sky keeps perfect time. I first learned about astrochronology in a forgotten corner of the library, in a dusty journal left by a wandering scholar. This field uses the stars to check historical dates. Eclipses and comets follow exact patterns. We can calculate when they happened, even in the distant past. So if an old document claims a lunar eclipse happened during a king's coronation, we can verify it. When inconsistencies arise, it's a sign that something is off. The real challenge is that many of the dates kept by the Church simply don't add up. Over the years, numerous historians have voiced their doubts, first in whispers, then more openly. They used astronomical data to argue that major events were misdated, that popes and emperors supposedly separated by centuries may have actually lived at the same time. These weren't minor errors, they were massive fractures in our understanding of history. Yet, whenever someone got too close to uncovering the truth, they faced pushback. I recall an astronomer from Eastern Europe, an exceptionally bright mind, who created a computer simulation of the night sky spanning 2 millennia. He compared it to medieval records and found countless discrepancies. After presenting his findings at a small conference, he vanished from the academic world. His work was erased, his papers disappeared, and even his name faded from official records. In another case, a priest who studied ancient Egyptian star charts believed they revealed a completely different chronology, one where events we consider medieval may have happened much earlier, or perhaps not at all. When he tried to present his discoveries to the Vatican's historical council, he was branded a blasphemer and stripped of his credentials. The Church has always claimed that faith and science can coexist, but only as long as science doesn't threaten the timeline of faith. The moment astronomical evidence begins to challenge the narrative, a hush descends, like a curtain falling at the end of a play. Some say the Gregorian calendar reform was just a technical correction. But what if it was also a reset, a way to conceal evidence that time itself had been manipulated? The stars remain above, silent witnesses to every night, never forgetting. Those who feared the stars feared something deeper, that truth doesn't need a pulpit, only illumination. The heavens have always shone, and when the stars couldn't be silenced, those who understood them were. Deep within the Vatican lies a room filled with the scent of ancient paper, leather, and secrets. It's not the well-known archive, but an older, quieter, more elusive chamber. It's absent from official maps, which is ironic, because it houses countless maps, hundreds, maybe thousands, stored in special cases or displayed under glass. These maps contradict everything we've been taught. I was allowed inside only once, under strict supervision. My guide was silent, merely gesturing. I was permitted to look, but not to write, touch, or ask questions. Immediately, I noticed coastlines that no longer exist. Islands in empty seas, mountains where there should be plains, and continents with unfamiliar shapes. Some maps depicted Antarctica without ice, showing rivers and vegetation. Others marked cities across the Atlantic with names unknown to history, places that officially never existed. One map bore a Latin warning, "Beware of vanished lands." There were maps showing civilizations that supposedly never met, trade routes spanning impossible distances, and temples in unexplored regions. The more I saw, the more I realized these weren't artistic errors. They were glimpses of a world we're no longer allowed to believe in. Many maps were copies of even older ones with layers of ink where scribes tried to erase or alter names. Yet, beneath the corrections, the truth persisted. One map stands out in my memory, a world sketch from the early 1500s showing both Americas long before Columbus, labelled with names, rivers and pyramid-like symbols. When I pointed it out, the archivist simply shook his head, saying it was still a secret. Why would the church keep maps that contradict its own history? Why hide them instead of displaying them? Because maps are powerful. They reveal not just where we are, but where we came from. If enough people studied the old maps, they might question why the new ones distort reality. Map-making is more than science. It's politics. Whoever controls the maps controls the narrative, the borders, the names, the memory. The Vatican guards not just religion, but geography. In those forgotten drawers are paths to places we're told never existed, were destroyed or perhaps still exist but are deliberately concealed. Maps don't forget, they wait to be understood. Sometimes the most unsettling discovery isn't being lost, but realizing you were never where you thought you were. There's a strange pattern woven through our accepted history. The deeper you dig, the more it seems that identities were swapped. Innovators became saints, experiments were rewritten as miracles, and knowledge was turned into legend, as if the past was edited, not erased, just renamed. I first noticed this while researching an old monastery renowned for healing. The records described miraculous recoveries from deadly illnesses, bones mending instantly, fevers cured by touch. The bishop attributed it all to divine intervention, yet, in the margins, someone had scribbled notes in a different ink. Ingredients, temperatures, methods. It looked more like medical documentation than a record of miracles. Gradually, I found similar stories. A man who purified water with minerals, later canonized as a saint, though his journals discussed chemistry. A woman who taught villagers to navigate by the stars, later mythologized as someone who simply followed divine signs. Her original letters vanished, leaving only prayers behind. It was a deliberate transformation, a choice to credit heaven rather than human ingenuity. When I asked an elderly priest about this, he gave a sad smile. He said the church didn't despise knowledge. It feared what happened when understanding overshadowed faith. When people no longer needed blessings, they no longer needed those who bestowed them. Instead of banning ideas outright, the church disguised them, dressing science in religious garb, turning inventors into saints and tools into relics. A machine became a saint's wheel, a telescope the eye of heaven, a book a vision. One file told of a young man who invented a device to measure rainfall and predict floods. He was accused of heresy, not for failing, but for succeeding too well. Leaders feared his invention would replace prayer. After his death, the church quietly canonized him, calling his device a divine gift, then hid it away and rewrote the story. This was more than a struggle for power, it was about controlling memory. By shaping how people remember the past, you shape how they imagine the future. In this reality, progress comes from prayer, not experimentation. New ideas are divine, not dangerous. We think of saints as purely holy, but perhaps some were brilliant thinkers, inventors, and healers, silenced in life, honoured in death. The line between miracle and invention is thinner than we're taught. Sometimes the greatest miracle is that knowledge survived at all. They didn't eliminate scientists, they sanctified them, It's easier to worship what you don't understand than to admit someone solved it before you. Monks, with their bowed heads, ink-stained hands, and quiet routines, are often seen as peaceful and devoted. But some were also intelligence agents. Monasteries weren't just places of worship. They were information hubs in a largely illiterate world. Monks held the keys to knowledge, and with that, influence. They didn't need armies, just silence and ink. Every monastery had a scriptorium for copying texts, but not all copies were faithful. I found documents with entire paragraphs removed or pages replaced. One monk confessed in a letter that he was ordered to erase certain names, rewrite events, and alter dates, not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the church's narrative. Monks travelled under the guise of pilgrimage, returning with more than prayers, information, rumours, reports of heresy. They were the church's spies, long before governments had such networks. If a village built a strange device or a scholar taught unusual ideas, the monks knew first. The information would move up the hierarchy, sometimes resulting in a quiet visit, a public trial, or simply vanished records. One chilling account described a coastal monastery that received a book from a traveller filled with knowledge about tides, winds, and the moon. The abbot praised it, then burned it, writing that such knowledge would lead people away from God. This wasn't just censorship, it was calculated memory management. Some monasteries had secret vaults for forbidden texts, kept for possible future use, even if the public couldn't access them. This changed how I saw those quiet, candle-lit rooms. Behind the peace was a surveillance network. Behind the ink, a hidden blade. The most disturbing part is how effective it was. Entire intellectual revolutions were stopped before they began. Not with violence, but with whispers, edits, and missing pages. The monks weren't just preserving history, they were shaping and controlling it. They didn't need armies to do it. They held sway over the past. Whoever commands the past shapes what's to come. Not every monk was a secret agent, but enough were to make you question what secrets those walls truly kept, and how many realities were locked away in silence. Most people step into cathedrals and see only splendour. The stained glass, the towering arches, the statues standing guard in quiet vigilance. But I was taught to look beyond the obvious, not at what was shown, but at what was concealed. Because within these stone sanctuaries, messages are etched into the hush, messages the church never acknowledged. My journey began at a cathedral renowned for its strange design. Tourists flocked for the bells and flickering candles, but I kept noticing oddities. Geometric patterns in the arches, windows placed with mathematical precision, sculptures that didn't match the official tales, lions with human faces, angels wielding compass-like instruments, spirals that hinted at ancient cosmic wisdom. One statue, hidden behind a column, caught my attention. It showed a man with a book, not a holy text, but one inscribed in a lost language. His eyes were closed, as if guarding knowledge instead of sharing it. Most cathedrals follow the Latin cross layout, yet some hide secret blueprints beneath. Labyrinths in the floors, measurements tied to planetary cycles. The builders were more than craftsmen. They were mathematicians, engineers, maybe even members of clandestine orders. They encoded ideas that would have been destroyed if spoken aloud. Even the locations of cathedrals tell stories, aligned with solstices, eclipses, and constellations, a kind of stone-bound astronomy. Why would a house of worship need to track the stars, unless its creators held knowledge they dared not reveal? One sculpture haunted me for days, a tower under construction morphing into a tree halfway up. Its branches wrapped around a sphere, not topped with a cross, but with a compass. Below, someone had carved, "Seek truth in silence." When I brought these findings to older priests, they brushed them off as artistic quirks or symbols of faith. but I could see in their eyes they knew more than they let on. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to be wary. The deeper I dug, the more it seemed these builders were leaving warnings, or perhaps instructions, not to places, but to ideas. Hidden truths carved in stone, meant to survive fire, censorship, and the passage of time. Cathedrals were built to teach the illiterate, but they didn't just teach scripture. They whispered secrets to those who could listen. Not all messages were about God. Some spoke of the stars, of knowledge, of power. The church tried to control the narrative, but stone endures. When you start to see these sculptures as acts of defiance, you begin to wonder how much of our history was carved in rebellion, right under the watchful gaze of faith. Europe isn't haunted by ghosts or demons, but by machines, remnants of inventions that shouldn't exist, ruins of systems no one can explain, tools buried in the earth that seem too advanced for their time. They call them anomalies. I call them mechanical ghosts. It started in an abandoned monastery garden, overrun and forgotten. Beneath the roots, I found a network of pipes and channels, more advanced than anything described in medieval texts. It wasn't just a well or aqueduct. It filtered water, cooled air, and collected condensation, almost like ancient air conditioning. No one knew who built it. The monks said it had always been there. Then I found sketches in the margins of forbidden manuscripts, spinning gears, spring-loaded cranks, moving parts. One looked like a clockwork device, another like a loom that could weave patterns on its own. The manuscripts date centuries before such machines were supposed to exist. Later, I visited a French church with a peculiar bell system. It chimed every hour perfectly, but there were no ropes, no one pulling. The caretaker claimed it hadn't worked in decades. When I investigated, I found a hidden wooden mechanism, gears and levers, once powered by water from a spring. Stories like these are everywhere, if you know what to ask. Villagers talk of ancient mills that ran without human touch, bridges so precisely carved they remain unchanged, locks so intricate no modern key fits, tools buried with craftsmen made from alloys unknown in that era. Some say these were lucky accidents by forgotten geniuses, but too many were hidden, destroyed, or credited to miracles. One document described a tower in Italy that once held a machine for mapping the stars with astonishing accuracy. The tower burned in a religious war, but survivors spoke of bronze gears and glass lenses powerful enough to spot ships hours before they arrived. The church often called these inventions dangerous, too close to witchcraft or a challenge to God. If people could create wonders without divine approval, what did that mean for the church's authority? So they silenced the machines, not by destroying them, but by burying them, erasing their inventors, calling their creations myths. Yet the ghosts linger in basements, ruins, and forgotten texts. They are echoes of a Europe far more inventive than we're told. A continent that may have buzzed with gears and whispered steam long before the industrial age. We haven't advanced. We've been held back. The machines left behind are the evidence. The first time I entered a church-run classroom, I thought I was entering a place of enlightenment, a room for truth, wisdom, and answers. But as time passed, I realised it was a place to forget, not in the usual sense, but a deeper, deliberate erasure from within. The lessons never changed. Memorise scripture, follow strict timelines, recite lists of saints and sinners. Questions were allowed, but only the right ones. If you asked why the Creator made identical stars, they praised your curiosity, but if you questioned why those stars didn't match church calendars, you were warned. I remember once asking why the scriptures ignored ancient empires we knew existed. My teacher's face darkened. He said some things were not to be discussed. The lesson moved on without me. That was the start of enforced silence. Every text had missing chapters. Every timeline hid lost years. Maps were oversimplified and only approved philosophers were mentioned. No astronomers, architects, or revolutionaries. The problem wasn't just the curriculum, it was the method. Memorization replaced discovery, recitation trumped logic. Conformity was rewarded, not curiosity. Submission, not wonder. One classroom had a diagram I'll never forget. The progression of transgression. At the very bottom, in tiny print, was one word: skepticism. That said it all. Skepticism was the enemy, not just disbelief in the divine, but questioning anything. Challenge the past and you threaten the present order. Challenge the present and you risk your soul. Some elderly monks later admitted they'd had similar doubts in their youth, but suppressed them. Questions led to reassignment, censorship, or exile to remote monasteries. I found hidden journals in an abandoned academy tucked behind the walls, pages filled with student questions. What happened to Hypatia? Why don't the stars match religious dates? Why do some sacred figures never appear in older texts? Why are certain innovations ignored? The questions went unanswered, but in the margins, someone had written, "This institution doesn't educate, it eliminates." That's when I understood. The church didn't just rewrite history in books, it rewrote consciousness year after year until no one remembered what was lost. The Academy of Cancellation wasn't a myth, it was real. And most chilling of all, it still is. Time seems simple, hours, weeks, centuries, each following the last. But what if those steps were rearranged? What if our timeline wasn't made to measure time, but to control it? The Vatican didn't just shape belief, it shaped the clock. Most people don't question calendars, we use them without thinking. But the switch from Julian to Gregorian was more than a leap year fix, it was a reset, a silent deletion. In 1582, Pope Gregory III introduced the new calendar. The reason? Easter had drifted from the spring equinox, so they corrected it. 10 days vanished. October 4th was followed by October 15th. Just gone. People accepted it, told it was for accuracy. But what else could be changed when no one questions missing time? 10 days here, 100 years there, maybe whole centuries. Eras rewritten and locked away. In old documents I found strange inconsistencies, events out of order, letters mentioning rulers who shouldn't have overlapped, weather records that didn't match the stars. The sky told one story, the church another. Some scholars whisper about the phantom time theory, the idea that centuries were added, that kings and popes wrote themselves into history, that our current year isn't what we think. One theory claims Otto III and Pope Sylvester II pushed the calendar forward to place themselves at the year 1000, a symbolic move to claim power at a millennium that never happened. The more I looked, the more contradictions I found, gaps in records, repeated events, entire lives missing. Calendars across Europe didn't match. The church's answer was always the same. Trust us, it's for your own good. But why would faith need to alter time? Because time is power. Control when things happened and you control their meaning. You can make some stories seem eternal, others disappear. Master the calendar and you master memory. When I brought this up to a retired bishop, he didn't deny it. He just said the church has always done what was needed to protect the truth. Then he smiled and said, "Sometimes truth demands sacrifice." I left, unsettled, not by lost years, but by realizing how deep the deception ran, not just in faith, but in reality itself. Time is our most precious shared resource, and the Vatican has turned it into a tool to rewrite history and hide what they want the world to forget. There's a story the church loves to repeat, a town saved from disaster by a saint's blessing, a statue that weeps real tears, a spring that bursts from dry ground after prayer. They call it divine intervention. But what if some miracles weren't from heaven at all? What if they were machines? In a forgotten archive, I found clues about a destroyed monastery inside a mountain, famous for a spring that never ran dry, even in drought. The water flowed endlessly. People called it holy, the clergy called it a miracle. But when I explored the ruins, I found stone pipes underground and what looked like a system of valves. Consider a simple yet clever water pressure regulator. Someone engineered that flow, no divine intervention required, just mathematics. I once heard about a saint statue that would kneel during services, hailed as a sign from above. Hundreds saw it. The church called it a miracle. But centuries later, a maintenance log in Latin revealed the truth. Ropes and counterweights, hidden from view, made it move. The craftsman who documented it was proud, calling it a marvel of engineering, one quietly dismantled when the church changed its stance on witchcraft. Throughout Europe, I found secret plans, towers designed to sway with the wind, shrines that lit up when certain prayers were spoken, crucifixes that turned to face the sun at noon. Some were clever tricks, others genuine breakthroughs, hydraulics, magnets, manipulation of light. But instead of celebrating the inventors, the church labelled these as miracles. Later, the creators were either canonized or erased from history. The spectacle was the source of power. If only saints or clergy could perform such wonders, the church alone held the keys to the divine. Admitting that ordinary artisans could achieve the same would have undermined the idea that these were gifts from heaven. I once asked an old priest about a rotating altar in a forgotten chapel. He smiled and said, "Sometimes the Almighty works through skilled hands." But he was careful, as if he knew he was treading dangerous ground. Miracles inspired awe and fear. Machines raised questions, and questions were dangerous. So, time and again, the church chose the miracle. It hid the blueprints and elevated the saints, turning engineers into legends and inventions into blessings. Over time, people forgot that many sacred events were powered by wires, gears, pulleys, and minds ahead of their era. Not every miracle was a trick, but not all were divine either. Some were simply misunderstood science, dressed up, and celebrated as holy. People often describe the Renaissance as a sudden burst of brilliance after centuries of darkness, a time when creativity and learning exploded. But what if it wasn't spontaneous? What if the Renaissance was carefully planned, a gradual release of knowledge by those who had hidden it for generations? While studying at the Vatican, I saw how many ancient texts were locked away, writings from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and lost civilizations. They weren't hidden because they were evil, but because they held power, knowledge of healing, construction, astronomy, and mathematics, far beyond what the church wanted the public to know. Then, around 1040, this wisdom began to reappear, not all at once, but in stages. A scroll here, a manuscript there, shared with trusted scholars. Artists started using mysterious symbols. Scientists resumed studying the stars. It didn't seem accidental. It was as if someone had opened a vault just enough to let out a spark, not enough to burn everything down. I found letters between church officials and early thinkers discussing how to control this new wave of ideas, making sure discoveries were credited to people the church could influence. They called it divine providence, but it was calculated. The great artists of the Renaissance, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, were more than painters. They were insiders. Their works hid mathematical secrets and ancient symbols, clues to forbidden knowledge. Their art was a puzzle, reality disguised as beauty. I once studied a mural with a hidden spiral in the clouds, matching a design from a forbidden manuscript I'd glimpsed behind glass. A text mapping the stars with methods lost for centuries. Coincidence? Unlikely. The Renaissance gave the world progress, but only with the church's approval. New ideas needed a blessing. Books were censored. Dangerous concepts were delayed or erased. Those who pushed too far, too soon, paid the price. Galileo knew this well, celebrated, then imprisoned, not for being wrong, but for speaking the truth before the church was ready. The more I learned, the more I realized that ancient knowledge was never lost, just hidden and returned when society was ready to accept it without question. The Renaissance was a grand chapter in human history, but grandeur can be a mask. Behind the beauty were shadows, unseen hands deciding what we remembered and what we forgot. This was not a sudden awakening, but a carefully staged revelation. The script was written long before the actors took the stage. Some flames never go out. They're protected, passed quietly from one guardian to the next. While the Vatican tried to bury forbidden knowledge, others worked in secret to preserve it. These weren't priests or church leaders, but artisans, astronomers, thinkers, and mystics, the hidden guardians. Their mission was to keep enlightenment alive. They took on many forms: Masons, Rosicrucians, Knights Templar. To outsiders, they looked like clubs or odd cults, but their symbols told another story. Mathematical shapes, sacred ratios, constellations pointing to ancient wisdom. While the church painted saints on ceilings, these groups carved formulas into stone and hid messages in manuscripts. I once examined a 13th century cathedral covered in strange markings, compass designs unrelated to doctrine but linked to the stars, proportions that matched human anatomy and planetary cycles. This building wasn't just for worship, it was a vault for knowledge, a silent rebellion in stone. In a forgotten abbey basement, I found a copy of a book the Vatican claimed was destroyed, an alchemical text written in gold ink that shimmered like stars. It described turning hidden light into matter. The priest who owned it wrote in the margin, "They tried to destroy it. I made another copy. Keep it moving." The Rosicrucians were said to guard Egyptian secrets, sealed chambers, libraries buried in the desert. Crusaders sometimes returned not with relics, but with blueprints and mysteries the church couldn't or wouldn't explain. The Masons were builders and philosophers. They studied Solomon's temple not just as history, but as a coded guide. They believed truth was hidden in design, in balance, in enlightenment itself. They didn't shout it from rooftops, they wove it into reality, in meeting halls, buildings, even city layouts. The church called them heretics and conspirators, but rarely lied outright. Deep down, the church knew what these societies protected, not myths or rebellion, but collective memory. Even alchemists, dismissed as dreamers seeking gold, were after something older. The recovery of lost wisdom, ways to unlock what had been sealed away. I met an old man in Portugal who claimed to be part of an unbroken chain of guardians. He showed me a ring with a symbol older than the cross, a compass ringed by flames. He said, "We don't fight them. We wait. Truth always returns. It just needs a place to grow." That's what these groups were, safe havens for forgotten knowledge. While the Vatican erased, they remembered. While the church destroyed, they preserved. They were the return of enlightenment. Despite persecution, their flame never died. It just went underground. And maybe now it's starting to surface again. The Vatican's secret archives are among the most protected places on earth. Not for gold or jewels, but for something far more precious. Memory, reality, maybe even fragments of time. The name Vatican Secret Archives is misleading. It's not just secret, it's hidden, locked away. The world has seen only a tiny fraction of what's inside. The entrance is unremarkable, a stone corridor, a metal door, an electronic scanner. But beyond that are over 50 miles of shelves, deep underground, lit by flickering lights and filled with documents no outsider has seen in centuries. Some are written in dead languages, some in symbols, some bound in materials that seem to hum when touched. I remember seeing the catalogue for the first time, a handwritten crimson leather book, slim as any reference volume, but the entries inside were like warnings. Manuscripts from before the flood, forbidden testimonies, stories of outcasts erased from history, technical drawings of devices centuries ahead of their time. One entry simply read, "Do not handle without Holy Office approval. Contents unstable. Unstable information. Imagine that. Words so powerful they must be isolated, not for what they are, but for what they could do. Change beliefs, rewrite history, reveal that we are not who we think we are. There are stories of Leonardo's letters describing flight, not as fantasy, but as engineering, as if he'd seen machines that wouldn't exist for centuries. There are tales of maps showing lands missing from modern charts, star charts that don't match our current models, timekeeping systems from civilizations wiped from memory, or something darker. A custodian who vanished in the 1990s claimed to have found a scroll sealed with black wax, inscribed in gold with a language of shapes older than Latin or Greek. He said that staring at it made him feel watched in return. The Church says the archives are restricted to protect sensitive material, to guard the truth until it's safe to share. But when is it ever safe? 100 years? 1,000? Or never? Because if even half of what's hidden there is real, everything we know about civilization would change. Our conflicts, our faiths, our inventions, our timelines, everything. The archives aren't just a place. They're a barrier between the world we know and the one that's been kept from us. The most unsettling part isn't what's inside, but the knowledge that we may never see it. Not because we can't understand, but because we might understand too well. There's a version of Scripture most people never see, not because it's lost, but because it's been deliberately buried. Pages removed, names erased, teachings that could have changed everything, hidden under layers of fear and destruction. They called them blasphemies, but they were something else, a different perspective, a new story, a truth too pure for the Church's empire to allow. These were the Gospels they tried to erase. Among the most mysterious is the Gospel of Thomas. This Gospel stands apart. There's no nativity, no crucifixion, just teachings, words attributed straight to Jesus, but the voice is different, closer, more personal, as if he's speaking to seekers, not crowds. One line echoes above all, "The kingdom is within you." That single idea could have upended centuries of authority. If God is inside you, why would you need anyone to mediate? Then there's the Gospel of Mary. Not Mary the mother, but Mary Magdalene, the woman recast as a sinner, to diminish her. Here, she's the one who truly understands Jesus, the one he confides in, the one the other disciples fear because her insight threatens their status. Through this lens, she wasn't just a follower. She was a teacher, maybe even more. When I first discovered these Gospels, hidden away in a locked drawer deep in forbidden archives, it felt like uncovering evidence of a cover-up. The pages were singed at the edges, as if someone tried to burn them, but stopped. The Latin labels didn't match the contents. It was as if they were hiding them from themselves. There are more. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Egyptians, texts that tell entirely different stories. Some say Jesus laughed at his betrayal. Some claim he never died. Others describe a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one. All were banned, all hunted down. Because if people had believed these stories, it would have revealed that the Church's foundation wasn't solid stone. It was built on silence. Why go to such lengths to erase words? Why burn scrolls, bury libraries, change names? If the official story is true, why fear alternatives? The answer is control. The forbidden Gospels empowered individuals. They made the sacred personal, not institutional. They turned God from a command into a whisper. That terrified those whose power depended on uniformity. Fragments of these Gospels survive in rumours, in the gaps between official lines. Maybe that's enough. Once truth is written, it can't be erased forever. Only delayed, only feared, and eventually rediscovered. There was a time when asking questions could cost you your life. Not political questions, just simple curiosity. Why do the stars move? What is the body made of? What causes lightning? In an age ruled by the Church, even wonder was dangerous. Curiosity wasn't encouraged, it was feared. Because curiosity opens doors. The Vatican spent centuries making sure some doors stayed shut. Picture a world where books were chained, where reading forbidden texts meant torture, where drawing the solar system differently could mean prison. That wasn't fiction. That was Europe for centuries. I once found a letter from a 15th century monk caught using magnifying glasses to study tiny creatures. It was brief. "My tools have been taken. I am forbidden from looking at God's creation without permission." That broke my heart. He wasn't defying doctrine, he just wanted to see more clearly. Even that was rebellion. The church claimed to stand for truth, but really, it controlled it. Scientists whose discoveries clashed with scripture were forced to recant or face punishment. Galileo was forced to deny what he saw, not because he was wrong, but because the world wasn't ready for the heavens to contradict the Bible. Philosophers too were targeted. Those who questioned existence, consciousness or time were branded heretics. Some were jailed, some executed, some simply vanished. Their works disappeared, their names erased. This wasn't just about religion, it was about power. If people started thinking for themselves, they might realize the church wasn't the only source of knowledge. That possibility frightened the leaders most of all. I once handled a forbidden anatomy book showing muscles, bones, blood flow. It had been secretly copied by students who risked everything to understand the body. Bloodstains marked the pages, not from the drawings, but from those who died to protect them. You might think this is ancient history, but even now, some texts are still banned, some research still silenced. The battle against curiosity never really ended, it just changed form. The truth is, the church wasn't just fighting science, it was fighting wonder, that spark in us that refuses easy answers, that drive to understand. When curiosity became a crime, knowledge became a forbidden weight. History was shaped not by what we learned, but by what we were never allowed to ask. But questions are stubborn. You can bury them, but they resurface. And when they do, everything shifts. It didn't begin with violence. It began with suspicion. Quiet warnings in sacred halls, glances exchanged by candlelight, a slow-growing fear, not born of cruelty, but of its potential. If you thought the wrong thoughts, studied the wrong things, or imagined too much, you risked being accused, not of evil, but of heresy. In those days, heresy was worse than crime. It was a crack in the illusion. The Inquisition didn't just target witches or rebels. It went after thinkers, creators, healers, astronomers, anyone who imagined a world outside the official story. Their tools weren't just torture and fire. They used silence, shame, turned neighbours into informers, students into traitors, families into accusers. I read the trial records of a young woman who asked in confession if animals had souls. Just asked. The priest reported her. She was arrested, interrogated, accused of unnatural thoughts. Her life unravelled over a single question. That's how fragile reason became, not because it was weak, but because it was dangerous. Schools shifted to value obedience over intelligence. Stories replaced learning, saints replaced scholars, wonder was called temptation, minds turned inward, not out of ignorance but for safety. It was safer to believe than to doubt, safer to repeat than to explore, safer to fear the unknown than to chase it. Generations grew up in that prison, never knowing they were locked in. That's the cruelest part. When the bars are tradition and the locks are guilt, you don't try the door. You learn to sit quietly, to pray when you want to ask, to obey when you want to create. I once saw sketches of inventions centuries ahead of their time. Machines to move towns, ideas for clean water, for flight, for light, without fire. All hidden in secret behind altars because their creators knew they'd be destroyed before they could be built. The Inquisition didn't just torture bodies, it crushed imagination. It changed what people felt was safe to think. When enough minds are trained to fear their own thoughts, you don't need physical chains. The prison is inside, but thought is patient. Some kept old ideas alive in code, in carvings, in art that looked religious but hid messages for the curious. Minds can be silenced, but not forever. Every time someone asks why, the silence cracks. Eventually, the questions return. The world starts thinking again, not because it's allowed, but because fear finally loses its hold. They didn't wear uniforms or command armies. They didn't conquer lands with banners, yet they shaped more than empires ever could. They moulded minds, controlled memory, rewrote history. They were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Their empire wasn't land, but silence. At first, they seemed like just another religious order, educated, disciplined, devout. But beneath the rituals was a plan, a structure. They knew the real battlefield was the classroom, the courtroom, the mind. I remember seeing a hand-drawn chart in the archives. It didn't map countries, but influence, universities, royal advisors, publishers, confessions. Each dot was a place a Jesuit had served. It looked less like a mission, more like a web across Europe. They started with education, not ordinary schools, but elite ones. They taught princes, trained diplomats, wrote textbooks. If you studied Latin, math, philosophy or theology in the 1600s, you probably learned from a Jesuit. With every lesson came something else, a subtle shaping, a narrowing of thought. You didn't just learn facts. You learned how to think, and more importantly, how not to. Then came the courts, not as lawyers but as confessors, spiritual advisors to rulers, whispering behind thrones, guiding in God's name and in politics. The Jesuits weren't just men of faith. They were strategists. They kept records, tracked secrets, knew who owed favours. Some say they knew about wars before armies moved, could stop conflicts with letters, or start them with rumours. Governments noticed. Some feared them. Some welcomed them. Some banned them. But bans didn't stop the mission. They worked in secret, took new names, kept going. Always teaching, always guiding, always watching. One document I found read, "The pen is mightier than the sword." No signature, but it was Jesuit. Their true power was never force, it was influence. You don't need to fight a king if you educate his heir. You don't need to burn books if you write them first. People still see the Jesuits as a religious group, and they are. But they're also architects of thought, engineers of memory, keepers of a history that serves something deeper than faith. Their empire was never loud, never obvious, but it was vast. It's still here, in how schools teach, how courts justify, how governments talk about truth and tradition. A silent empire. Silence has always been their sharpest tool. Most people think of time as fixed, a sunrise, a calendar, a clock. But what if time isn't just something we follow, but something we're led through, like a hallway designed to control where we go and what we see? That hallway has an architect. For centuries, it was the church. They didn't invent time, but they shaped it, trimmed it, hid parts, inserted others, all to build a history that fit their story. Control the past, and you control the present. Shape the future before it arrives, and you control what people believe is possible. Once in the archives I found a small box labelled only with a date. Inside were letters between priests and astronomers, trying to align the calendar with the stars. Not for accuracy, but for power. They decided when holy days would fall, not by real events, but by symbols, by message, by control. Take Easter. Its date changes every year, tied to the full moon after the spring equinox. It sounds poetic, but it's strategic. It keeps the most important Christian event shifting, impossible to pin to a single historical moment. The resurrection becomes an emotion, not a fact. Emotions are easier to control than facts. Then came the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. Officially, it was to fix leap years. In a single night, 10 days simply disappeared. People awoke to find themselves 10 days ahead, as if time itself had been edited. Lives were lost to a bureaucratic decision. Who was behind this? Pope Gregory III. The Church didn't just adjust the calendar, it altered the very fabric of reality. Even prophecies were recalibrated. Predictions of the apocalypse, messiahs, and celestial omens were all scheduled to fit the Church's timeline. Anything that didn't match the official story was labelled heresy and erased. But if a new star appeared or a comet blazed across the sky and it could be linked to Scripture, it became a tool used to keep the faithful anxious, obedient, and fearful. To control time is to control memory, and memory is the bedrock of our existence. It defines who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. Whoever commands the calendar, the clock, and the prophecies commands your story. And whoever shapes your story can make you believe almost anything. The Church became the keeper of time, not just hours and days, but epochs and destinies. They decided when history started and when it would end. In doing so, they went beyond religion. They became the chroniclers of time itself. The more you investigate, the more you realise that time isn't just passing. It's being narrated line by forces older than we imagine. When you enter a cathedral, it's easy to be awed by its grandeur. The soaring ceilings, the stained glass, the interplay of light and shadow. But what if that beauty had a deeper purpose? What if it was a message, a secret code carved into stone, waiting to be found? Not written in words, but in shapes, numbers, and patterns. The builders knew their task. They weren't just making places to pray, they were creating vaults of knowledge. I recall gazing at the dome of an old basilica in southern France. Something felt unusual, not wrong, but too precise. The symmetry, the measurements, the way sunlight struck the altar at exactly noon on a certain day each year. It was too deliberate to be chance. Looking closer, I found it, repeating circles and triangles, proportions matching star charts, the golden spiral hidden in the architecture. This was more than art, it was information. Sacred geometry is the idea that certain shapes have meaning, that the universe itself follows patterns. The circle stands for infinity, the triangle for harmony, the square for stability. These weren't just symbols, they were instruments. Medieval builders used them as priests used scripture to protect truths too dangerous to speak aloud. When words were forbidden, books destroyed, and dissent punished, architects turned to math. Geometry became their language, hidden in plain sight, behind altars, under bell towers, in monastery blueprints. They embedded ancient wisdom in the very stones of the church. In one chapel, I found a secret diagram beneath layers of plaster. When uncovered, it revealed a star map perfectly aligned with the building. The church had hidden it centuries ago, likely without understanding its meaning. But the original builders knew they were sending a message about time, the stars, and something the Vatican would rather forget. Some cathedrals were even designed to resonate at specific sound frequencies, not by accident, but by design. These frequencies matched ancient musical intervals linked to healing, meditation, and heightened awareness. The builders had knowledge the clergy lacked, or maybe the clergy knew and chose to keep silent. It makes you wonder how much wisdom has been lost, or worse, deliberately hidden. Because if a window's shape can hint at a lost planet, or a hallway's path can encode a sacred formula, then the church sits atop a mystery it never solved, or pretended not to. The architects couldn't speak openly, but they built with intention. Every line, every measurement, every stone was part of a message. And that message wasn't for kings or cardinals, but for the future. For those who would one day ask why these places feel so extraordinary, why they resonate with something older than faith. Some truths can't be spoken. They must be carved, expressed through math, stone, and silence, waiting to be understood. There's the church everyone sees, the one with balconies, blessings, and bells ringing over cities, the one that holds public ceremonies and makes statements for the world. But beneath that surface, some say, is another church, one that doesn't address the crowds or answer to the Pope. A hidden power, quietly pulling strings. They call it the church beneath the church. I first heard rumours from an old scholar in Rome. He wouldn't say names, but he showed me symbols carved where no tourist would look. Strange marks on library walls, seals on secret letters. He said if the Vatican was a stage, this was the backstage, the control room, the silent watcher behind everything. This secret group isn't listed in any official records. You won't find it in Vatican directories or annual reports. But the signs are there. Decisions made without explanation, priests rising to power with no clear background, entire projects started and then abandoned for no reason. Someone is making those calls, and it's not always the man in white. There are whispers of a council, not cardinals, not bishops, but something older and more discreet. People who don't wear robes but hold centuries of knowledge and influence. Some say they meet deep beneath Vatican City, in hidden rooms and passages leading to vaults protected not just by locks, but by secrecy. One night in the archives, I found a restricted journal. It mentioned a place called the Black Room. No details, just that it was below where official records end. A priest once assigned to clean nearby wrote, "I heard voices beyond the stone. They knew I was listening." Even the Pope isn't immune to this shadow. Some believe he gets reports but isn't told everything, that he's a figurehead, while others control the money, politics, doctrine, and collective memory. This could explain why popes talk about reform, then go quiet. Why investigations start but never finish. Why history repeats in patterns too perfect to be random. The church beneath the church doesn't want followers. It wants order, preservation, control over what's remembered and what's forgotten. It doesn't need prayers or parades, just obedience and silence. If this hidden network is real, it changes everything. The Vatican isn't just a religious centre, it's a mask. And behind that mask are forces that have shaped kings, toppled empires, and rewritten history without ever stepping into the light. And maybe, if the church beneath the church is real, we were never supposed to know what else it hides, or how deep the truth goes. Some years leave a mark. Wars start, rulers die, meteors blaze across the sky. But then there are years that seem too quiet, too empty, like chapters in a story no one remembers reading. These aren't just blank years. Some believe they never happened at all. This is the theory of the year that never was. It started with a question. Why do some centuries seem to leave no trace? From 614 to 911 AD, the world appears strangely silent. Few records, no major inventions, no lasting buildings. Whole generations passed with almost nothing to show. Historians call it the Dark Ages, but what if that darkness was manufactured? What if someone deliberately turned out the lights? Enter the phantom time hypothesis, the idea that about 300 years of history were simply invented. Not lost, not forgotten, but fabricated by powerful rulers who wanted to change their place in time. The main suspects: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Sylvester III. Together, they had the means, motive, and opportunity to alter the calendar. According to this theory, Otto wanted to rule in the year 1000, a year of prophecy and renewal, but he was born too early. So, instead of waiting, he changed the dates, added years, moved events. Suddenly his reign matched the millennium, and the church backed him up. After all, if the faithful change time, it must be divine, right? The switch from the Julian to Gregorian calendar adds fuel to this theory. When the change happened in 1582, 10 days were dropped to fix the drift. But some argue the correction should have been much bigger, as if the missing time was never real to begin with. Astronomy backs this up. Recorded eclipses don't always match where they should be. Stars seem out of place by centuries. It's as if the sky remembers something we don't. Even some rulers seem like phantoms. Charlemagne, for instance, his empire was vast, his legend even bigger. But the real evidence for his existence is odd. Most of what we know comes from documents written long after he supposedly died. Statues, writings, coins, all too perfect, as if made to fill in the blanks. Of course, mainstream historians reject this. They say the theory is flawed, that lost records and human error explain the gaps. But the suspicion lingers. History is full of placeholders, years we've learned about, but never truly lived. Leaders we're told to honour, but who left no trace. The idea that time can be faked is chilling, because if you can fake the past, you can control the future. You decide what came before, who mattered, what was erased. You shape reality itself, and maybe that's why the Church took part, not just to bless the lie, but to protect it. Because once you admit time can be changed, you have to wonder what else has been rewritten. And how much of what we know was never real at all? It was small, just a wrinkled scrap of parchment tucked away inside an unrelated manuscript. No identifying marks, no reason for it to have lasted this long. Yet it did, and when the priest unfolded it, he instantly knew it was never meant to be found. The ink was nearly gone, but the words were clear, written in a blend of Latin and a secret dialect used only by Vatican scribes. This wasn't a prayer or a confession. It was a directive, a set of instructions dated more than 8 centuries ago. And at the bottom, a name that shouldn't exist, one tied to a council that official history denies ever took place. The document detailed the deliberate destruction of certain texts, not heretical tracts or pagan rituals, but ancient versions of the scriptures themselves, fragments of the Gospels, astronomical records, treatises on healing, sound and light. The list was long. Some works had already disappeared from every known archive. Others had never been catalogued at all. It was as if someone had carved a hole in both time and memory. And here it was, described in careful, deliberate handwriting. What struck the priest most was the calmness of the tone. It wasn't panicked or harsh. It was methodical, almost routine, as if erasing knowledge was just another part of maintaining the church, like sweeping the floors or mending robes. There was no regret, just a final, chilling line. The faithful should not remember what never served the faith. For days the priest obsessed over the document. He read and reread it. Names, dates, references. One location appeared twice, a sealed chamber beneath a basilica in Ravenna. Officially, it was just an unused tomb. But an old map revealed something more, a second level beneath the tomb, with no stairs or entrance, as if it had been built and buried in the same era. That was the breaking point. He had tolerated the silence for years, accepted the mysteries, even overlooked missing chapters and empty shelves. But this was different. This was evidence of a plan, proof that forgetting had been engineered, just like the cult. He realised he couldn't keep it secret. So he copied the document by hand, no digital traces, no scans. He hid the copy somewhere no one would ever think to look, not even the church. As for the original, he burned it. Not out of fear, but to erase any trail, to make sure the revelation couldn't be traced back to him. The implication was both simple and devastating. Memory had been turned into a weapon. Forgetting wasn't a historical accident. It was a tool of control. The church wasn't just a guardian of the sacred. It was an editor of reality, deciding what survived and quietly erasing the rest. The seal was broken, and for the first time he was more than a priest. He was a witness. And that made him dangerous. There are still things the church fears. Not bombs or protests or angry letters, but questions. Old questions that never got answers. Questions that tug at secrets they've spent centuries hiding. not because they don't know the answers, but because they do. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits, silent, in locked rooms and crumbling manuscripts with names no one dares to say. And the greatest secret isn't about angels, demons, or even Christ. It's about time, about who wrote the story we all live in and what they chose to leave out. If people discovered that entire centuries were fabricated, that calendars were changed to create prophecies, or that the stars don't match the dates we're told, the illusion would shatter. If they saw how science was replaced by miracles, how whole civilizations were buried under saints, the cracks would be impossible to hide. They fear the Gospel of Thomas because it claims the kingdom of God is already here. They fear Mary Magdalene because she was more than a follower, she was a teacher. They fear old maps showing lost continents and devices older than the church itself. Not because these things are evil, but because they reveal the deception. The lie works because it feels complete. We're taught that history is settled, a straight line, but it's not. It's full of edits, omissions, substitutions. And behind every change is a motive, control. Because if you shape the past, you decide who matters now. You shape what people can imagine for the future. What they fear most is the true inquisition, the one that doesn't stop at easy answers or dusty books. The one that reads forbidden texts and asks why pages are missing. The one that looks at the stars and wonders why they don't fit the church's calendar. The one that listens to the silence and hears what's missing. They fear the return of forgotten names, names that once opened doors, healed the sick and moved stones with sound. They fear someone will walk into a cathedral and realise the carvings aren't just art, they're instructions. They fear that once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. That memory will awaken and never sleep again. This isn't about destroying faith, it's about freeing it. It's about pulling back the curtain and letting people choose what to believe. Eyes wide open. Because faith built on fear isn't faith, it's control. If you've come this far, you already sense it. That itch in your mind. That feeling that something doesn't add up. Don't ignore it. Pursue it. Question everything. Because the greatest threat to those in power isn't rebellion, it's remembering. And sometimes remembering is the most dangerous thing you can do, but it's also the most vital. The story they've always told is the same. The light faded, darkness fell, people forgot how to think, build, and dream. They called it the Dark Ages, as if the world itself went blind. But maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe the light wasn't lost, it was hidden. There are still embers burning under centuries of debris. Not just in books or ruins, but in you. In the questions that won't leave you alone. In the quiet moments when something feels off. When history sounds too neat, too perfect, too edited. The truth hasn't disappeared. It's scattered, locked away, carved in stone. Passed down in paintings, architecture, legends. The flame never died. They just built walls around it. And now those walls are starting to crack. You don't need permission to ask. You don't need a title or blessing to wonder what came before. You just need to care enough to look, to read between the lines, to notice what's missing. Because what was erased still echoes. The pages they burned still cast shadows, and memory always finds a way back. This journey was never about anger or revenge. It was about remembering, reclaiming, about seeing the world as it truly is, not as they want you to see it. A world rich with knowledge that never belonged to just one group. A place where truth doesn't bow to authority. And maybe the biggest secret isn't hidden in some vault under the Vatican. Maybe it's that you were never meant to forget. That deep down you always sensed something was wrong. That all those so-called heresies, forbidden gospels and lost centuries aren't just errors. They're clues, warnings, evidence. Truth isn't what we're handed, it's what we uncover. The light was never lost. It was buried under fear, obedience and silence. But you're here now, and that matters. It means you're willing to see, to feel the discomfort of realising you've been misled. To ask what else has been hidden. And you're not alone. There are others, quiet voices rising, artists, dreamers, ex-priests, historians, rebels, people who dig into the past not to destroy it, but to set it free. People who believe the light belongs to everyone, not just a chosen few. So carry it, share it, guard it when they try to snuff it out again, because they will. But this time, it's different. This time, we remember, and that changes everything.